Alright, so this is going to be a really quick video about how I use XTC-3D Epoxy, and I can't say that, so I'm not going to try. I'm just going to call it epoxy from now on. But basically the general rules of how you actually mix the stuff is 2 parts of part A to 1 part of part B. Part B is the hardener, and in general, if I have to choose uneven proportions, I'm going to put a little bit more hardener in than part A. I've just found it might make it cure a little bit faster and give you less working time, but I have found that if I don't put enough hardener in, there'll be little tacky bits all over the resin in the end, and I pretty much never like that because it means I have to sand it back down and then re-go over it again, which is just a pain. So the larger batch you mix, usually the more forgiving the ratios are, because if you're using like teaspoons, 2 drops is a lot different to a teaspoon than it is to a gallon pail. Usually I mix my batches with plastic spoons, so I'll do like 2 plastic spoons of part A and 2 plastic spoons of part B, because I'm eccentric and usually don't need all that much at once. Little of this stuff goes a long way, and it takes like 10 seconds to mix up a batch, so you can always make more. Apart from that, you do want to make sure that you mix this as evenly as possible, and this is written in at least 1 or 2 spots on their instructions, and I would just like to confirm that you should not mix this in a plastic cup and then leave it in a plastic cup, because it will melt it. And the reason that happens is the epoxy cures with a chemical reaction, which is exothermic, meaning that it releases heat, and that heat is enough to melt a plastic cup. It will also cure faster and generate more heat the thicker it is. So usually what you'll do if you're going to mix it in a cup is then sort of scrape it out and pour it onto something flat, like a paper plate. Most of the time I use wax paper, because just sort of what I have on hand. It does soak through that eventually, so maybe double layered if you're going to use wax paper. You can also tint the stuff. I've heard of a bunch of different things you can use. Personally, I've tried both cheap acrylic craft paints as well as alcohol inks, and both have worked really well actually and caused no like weird reactions in any of the epoxies. So the alcohol inks are clear, so they are going to give you a clear finish in your epoxy when it finally cures, compared to the craft paint. That being said, unless you put in a lot of craft paint, it's still going to be a little bit transparent, just kind of not as much as perhaps the alcohol ink would be. Most of the time I use acrylic because I just have a lot of it on hand in a lot of different colors, and darn it, it's convenient. So I usually just sort of throw in a few drops in the epoxy when I'm first mixing it, and you can always add more later if you realize that you need more pigment. It seems to be pretty forgiving with the ratios. I've done like the 2 parts of part A, 1 part part B, and then probably like 3/4 of a part of acrylic paint, and it doesn't seem to have affected the print at all. And the reason that you might want to tint it is either for some cool painting effects, or in my case, I print weird colored plastics. So if I'm painting a helmet that's metal or something like that, sometimes I'll tint my epoxy coat underneath, so that if I scratch the paint, it goes down to black epoxy instead of like fluorescent blue PLA. So that's what you can do if you want to color the stuff. I'm sure they also make like resin colorants specifically for this kind of thing. I just have never tried them because, frankly, I'm really cheap. Apart from that, you can use, or most people at least use, a foam brush or a chip brush, like one of those just really aggressive sort of bristly little brushes you use to paint your house and stuff. You can use either of those to apply your epoxy. I use both. It just kind of depends on, you know, what I have or what's cheap at the time. I will say that the paint brushes seem to do a better job of not absorbing all your epoxy. If you work with a chip brush enough, or I'm sorry, if you work with a foam brush enough, they will sort of suck up a bunch of epoxy to the point where you can like squeeze it with your hand and it will just ooze out of the brush. I have also found that the foam brushes, I don't know if I'm just ridiculously abusive to them, or just I'm using really, really cheap foam brushes, but they fall apart really fast. And when I say fall apart, I mean like they leave little blobs of foam in my epoxy if I'm like being really aggressive with the application, or if I'm doing something really detailed where I'm like stippling it or something like that. So I do kind of prefer brushes for that reason, if I have them on hand. Fun tidbit, if you do use brushes and you don't want to keep reusing brushes, you want to try to maybe be a little bit more environmentally friendly, or just not pay for a bunch of brushes, you can actually rinse them out and reuse them. if you just get like a gallon of distilled white vinegar, just like the regular super cheap stuff you find at a store, once you're done with your brush, pour some of it into, I usually just pour it into my glove and then just swirl the brush around in the vinegar. And I'll do that a few times until it seems like most of the epoxy residue has been removed. And then I'll grab some dish soap, put it in my hand, pretty much repeat, maybe add a little bit more vinegar, but basically just washing it primarily with vinegar and then maybe sort of as a backup some dish soap until it is relatively clean. And in my experience, it's really hard to get all of the epoxy out, but you can get enough out where your brush is like pretty dang usable after that. Like I've used the same brush for 20 or 30 separate applications of epoxy, and honestly, the bristles fell off before the brush was destroyed. So it does seem to be pretty effective if you are into that kind of thing. When do I use epoxy? So my personal preference, I don't like to use this stuff on like really detailed models because I just find it kind of has a tendency to pool in the details and basically get rid of them or obliterate them. It can also be hard to hit all of the areas of your model. So I usually try to use this on things where either I don't care if there's a little bit of softening under, you know, hard edges. If you have like a 90-degree angle, you don't mind a little bit of epoxy sort of pooling in that and rounding it out slightly. Or on just like really large smooth models that I just want to be smooth. Something like, you know, a plain helmet or like a sort of flattish face mask is a lot of times what I'll use epoxy for. But it really just kind of depends, again, on how you like working with it and what you're doing at the time. I have actually been known to use epoxy, not as frequently, but sometimes if I really want like an obnoxiously shiny shine on my model, I'll just coat the whole thing in epoxy as a finishing coat. And it seems to work pretty well. Apart from that, I have heard, and this is anecdotal because I have never tried it, I have heard that you can thin it with, I believe, like regular isopropyl rubbing alcohol, if you need, and honestly, at some point I might try that. But you can also, there's like weird stuff you can use to thicken it, which, again, I've also never tried, and I personally don't see a reason why I would want that, but other people seem to be very into the thickening of the epoxy. Other miscellaneous notes, if you need to thin it, I've also heard that you can microwave it, microwave part A, which is the very viscous, gloopy part, for about 30 seconds. I've never tried that. I don't know. I don't love the idea of putting that in my microwave. It seems fumey and gross, but it is a thing that you can apparently do. You can also soak part A in a little thing of hot water to warm it up, and that'll also make it runnier and easier to work with as well. Apart from that, if you guys have noticed, pretty much the price tag of like I think a 24-ounce thing of this resin is about $27 to $30 depending on where you're getting it. You can find it a lot of times in the sort of local fancier craft stores like Blick or Plaza. You can also find it on Amazon, assorted other places. But there is a sort of cheaper alternative, and that is using fiberglass resin, which you can get at a local hardware store in ginormous containers for a significantly cheaper price. That being said, I've never tried that because the XTC-3D is much less smelly, and it seems from what I've read that you can get away with a little bit less aggressive like respirator masks and stuff like that. Like fiberglass resin you definitely need a proper respirator mask for because this stuff is like really fumey and it's like very much not good to breathe in. And I'm sure strictly speaking the XTC-3D shouldn't be huffing it, but it seems slightly less bad from what I understand. I could be completely wrong about that. If anybody knows the science of this, please do let me know because yeah. Cool. That was not a good reason, but that is pretty much all I have for how I usually use XTC-3D. So hopefully you guys found that helpful or something. About to make another one about using Durham, so I will see you in like whenever the videos get cut together.